To understand how the British Empire began, we must journey back to a world on the brink of transformation, a time when the map of the world was still incomplete and the seas beckoned with both promise and peril. In the late 16th century, England, and to a lesser extent Scotland, were relatively minor powers on the European stage, overshadowed by the dazzling wealth and global reach of Spain and Portugal. These two Iberian kingdoms had ventured into the unknown, carving out empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and returning home with vast riches. Their success did not go unnoticed. It stirred a restless ambition in other European states, including England, which now gazed outward with a mix of envy, curiosity, and determination. The motivations behind this surge of exploration and expansion can be summed up in three familiar words: God, glory, and gold. The pursuit of economic gain was central. There were fortunes to be made in spices, gold, and new trade routes. But religious motives also spurred the English onward, as many hoped to spread Christianity to distant lands. For others, the lure was adventure and the chance to win fame or favor back home. These impulses converged at a moment when new sailing technologies and a spirit of daring made oceanic voyages possible, if still perilous. The age of discovery had already seen the Portuguese and Spanish charting new waters, establishing colonies, and reaping the rewards. Their achievements not only changed the fate of their own countries, but also shifted the balance of power in Europe and inspired rivals to follow. England, France, and the Netherlands all began searching for their own entry into this new global arena. For England, the first tentative step came in 1497, when John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, reached the shores of Newfoundland. His voyage was an exploration, not an attempt at colonization, but it set a precedent for English exploration and established a claim on North American territory. In the decades that followed, English explorers and merchants repeatedly sought new trade routes to Asia, searching for a northwest passage and other avenues to the wealth of the East. These early efforts were often marked by uncertainty and failure, but they laid the groundwork for what was to come. The real turning point arrived in the early 17th century, after several unsuccessful attempts, including the lost colony of Roanoke and a failed venture in Newfoundland. The English finally established their first permanent settlement in the Americas in 1607. Jamestown, set on the banks of the James River in Virginia, was born out of hope, desperation, and the backing of the Virginia Company, a joint stock company formed to pool resources and share the risks and rewards of colonization. The Virginia Company was not alone in its ambitions. Other joint stock companies soon emerged, each seeking to secure a place for England in the lucrative world of overseas trade. The East India Company, founded in 1600, would become one of the most powerful and influential trading entities in history, opening commercial links with India and later extending its reach across Asia. The Levant Trading Company, established in 1578, focused on trade with the Eastern Mediterranean, while the Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, set out to exploit the fur trade in northern North America. These companies were more than just businesses. They were engines of empire. They financed voyages, built trading posts and settlements, and negotiated, sometimes peacefully, often not, with local populations and rival European powers. The Royal African Company, created in 1660, became a dominant force in English trade with Africa, dealing in gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans. Until 1697, it held a monopoly on English trade with Africa, a privilege that brought both wealth and controversy. Such companies reflected a pattern of expansion driven less by royal command than by the initiative of individuals, adventurers, and enterprising merchants. The Crown granted charters and sometimes provided military support, but much of the early British Empire was built by private interests seeking fortune abroad. The Scottish story unfolded alongside, though more precariously. Scotland, too, harbored ambitions for overseas trade and colonization. The Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies, active from 1695 to 1707, embodied this effort, though it faced significant economic and political obstacles. Earlier Scottish attempts included a colony in Nova Scotia, lost in 1632, and the infamous Darien Scheme, an ill-fated bid to establish a Scottish trading colony on the Isthmus of Panama. These ventures met with little lasting success, but they underscored a broader British appetite for overseas expansion. As the 17th century progressed, English and, in part, Scottish settlements began to take root across the Atlantic. North America saw the establishment of colonies in Virginia, Maryland, and the New England region. In the Caribbean, English settlers arrived on islands like Barbados and Jamaica, laying the foundations for lucrative sugar plantations. Trading posts appeared along the coast of Africa and in the bustling markets of Asia, each outpost a small foothold in an expanding web of commerce. The motivations for these colonies were as varied as the landscapes themselves. Some aimed to provide new markets for English goods, others served as sources of raw materials such as tobacco, sugar, and later cotton. There was also a social dimension. The colonies offered a place to send England's poor, the dispossessed, and those seeking new beginnings. Over time, these outposts would develop their own distinct identities, but in their early years, they depended heavily on support and direction from home. Economic policies soon followed expansion. Beginning in 1651, the Navigation Acts established a tightly controlled mercantilist system, requiring that colonial exports and imports be transported on English ships. This created a closed economy intended to benefit the mother country, ensuring that wealth from the colonies flowed back to England rather than into the hands of rival powers. Competition fueled much of the early British colonial project. At every turn, English expeditions found themselves contending with the established interests of Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands. This rivalry was not limited to trade or territory. It often erupted into open conflict as each power sought to protect or expand its holdings. The development of the British Empire, then, cannot be understood in isolation. It was shaped by the shifting alliances and enmities of a crowded and contested world. By the end of the 17th century, England had emerged as a significant maritime power. Its ships sailed the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Its merchants traded in furs, spices, sugar, and slaves. Its flags flew over settlements in North America, the West Indies, and India. Though the empire was still small by later standards, the outlines of a global presence were clear. The First British Empire, as historians often call this period, was taking shape, focused on the Atlantic world and the wealth of the Americas and the Caribbean. It is important to note that the early British Empire was not a centrally planned or tightly managed enterprise. Rather, it was a patchwork of dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates, and other territories, united by the authority of the British monarchy, but often governed on the ground by local elites, company officials, or adventurers. The crown provided legitimacy and, at times, military power, but much of the drive for expansion came from below, from the restless energy of merchants, explorers, and settlers. The documentary record of this period, charters, company records, and correspondence, offers glimpses into the ambitions and anxieties of the age. These primary sources reveal the practical challenges of colonial life, the shifting fortunes of trade, and the political maneuverings at home and abroad. They speak of hope and hardship, of fortunes made and lost, and of a world being remade through commerce and conflict. The early expansion of the British Empire, then, was a complex and dynamic process. It was propelled by a mix of motives, economic, religious, personal, and shaped by competition with rival empires. Its foundations were laid by a diverse cast of characters, from merchants and mariners to dreamers and desperados. It began as a handful of precarious settlements and trading posts scattered across distant shores, but would grow into one of the largest and most influential empires in history. Yet, as we consider these origins, it is clear that the story of the British Empire's rise is inseparable from the stories of those whose lands and lives were touched and often irrevocably altered by the empire's reach. The search for profit, the drive for dominion, and the exchange of goods and people across oceans would have consequences that echoed far beyond the ambitions of those who set sail from English and Scottish ports so many centuries ago. In tracing the roots of the British Empire, we see a world in motion, a world driven by the pursuit of God, glory, and gold, a world where companies could command fleets and fortunes, a world where the boundaries of what was possible seemed to expand with every voyage. These foundations set the stage for an era of imperial growth that would reshape not only Britain, but the world itself. The story of the British Empire's beginnings is thus one of ambition, competition, innovation, and profound transformation, a story whose legacies are still felt today. In the long arc of world history, few empires have loomed as large as the British Empire at its height in the 18th and 19th centuries. By 1913, Britain ruled over 412 million people, and by 1920, the empire stretched across a staggering 24% of the Earth's land surface. Its territories dotted every continent, and the boast that this was the empire on which the sun never sets was rooted in fact, not just imperial pride. Yet such dominance was neither foreordained nor inevitable. It was the result of decades of calculated strategy, bitter conflict, technological transformation, and, above all, a relentless pursuit of commerce and power. The path to global supremacy was shaped by a constant struggle with rival European powers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, France and the Netherlands stood as the chief competitors. The contest for overseas dominion played out on battlefields and in distant colonies, but perhaps nowhere was the outcome more decisive than in the 7 Years' War, often considered the first truly global conflict. The British victory in this struggle, particularly after the pivotal Battle of Plassey in 1757, reshaped the world map. In North America, the defeat of France gave Britain control over vast tracts of land, while in India, the East India Company's triumph at Plassey opened the door to dominance over the subcontinent. The British were not just victors in war, but masters of strategic positioning, able to exploit their adversaries' weaknesses and turn military success into lasting political and economic control. Yet even empires must adapt to setbacks. The loss of the 13 American colonies in 1783 was a profound blow to British prestige and power. Rather than signaling a retreat, however, this defeat marked a pivot, a reorientation of imperial ambition toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The British imagination now stretched far beyond the Atlantic, hungry for new markets, raw materials, and opportunities for expansion. The story of the empire's rise to dominance is, in many ways, the story of this remarkable ability to regroup and redirect its energies. At the heart of Britain's imperial engine was the Royal Navy. Its supremacy on the world's oceans was not merely a matter of national pride, but the critical underpinning of empire itself. The Navy's warships guarded the sea lanes that carried goods, people, and information between Britain and its far-flung possessions. In an age when piracy, privateering, and rival navies threatened commerce at every turn, the Royal Navy's blue-water dominance ensured that British trade could flourish. There was a tight interdependence here. Trade generated the wealth that paid for naval expansion, while the Navy's protection made trade possible. This power and plenty cycle became self-reinforcing, each success fueling the next. It is no exaggeration to say that British imperial supremacy was built as much on oak timbers and cannon as on gold and silver. Commerce, in turn, was not a haphazard affair. The British state and its partners in the merchant community operated within the disciplined framework of mercantilism. Colonies were not seen as ends in themselves, but as cogs in a carefully calibrated economic machine. They provided raw materials, cotton, sugar, tea, spices, and later, minerals, which were shipped to Britain, processed in its factories, and then sold back to colonial markets or further abroad. This arrangement enriched the metropole and tied the colonies ever more tightly to the imperial economy. The importance of mercantilism was underscored by the meticulous records kept by British authorities. Trade statistics, customs documents, and government correspondence all attest to the centrality of commerce in imperial thinking. The British Empire's commercial and naval might did not operate in a vacuum. The late 18th century witnessed a technological and economic upheaval that would give Britain an unassailable edge: the Industrial Revolution. It began quietly enough with innovations in spinning, weaving, and steam power, but quickly transformed every facet of British life. Factories could now produce goods on a scale and at a speed previously unimaginable. This surge in manufacturing capacity required both raw materials and markets, and the empire provided both. The Industrial Revolution thus became both a cause and a consequence of imperial expansion. With technological advances in transportation and communication, the British could project power and influence across greater distances than ever before, outpacing their European rivals. Nowhere was this symbiosis more visible than in the activities of the East India Company. Having established a foothold in Bengal after Plassey, the company became not just a trading corporation, but the de facto ruler of vast territories. Through a mix of military conquest, alliances, and annexations, British control spread across the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company built its own armies, levied taxes, and administered justice, creating a parallel state that operated under the British flag. In time, the company's power would be absorbed directly by the British Crown, but its legacy in shaping the contours of empire was immense. The 19th century brought a further acceleration of expansion. The so-called scramble for Africa saw Britain acquire new territories across the continent, often in competition with other European powers. In Central Asia, British agents and soldiers played the great game, seeking to counter Russian advances and secure their own interests. The British presence extended into Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, each new acquisition strengthening the empire's global reach. This was a period of feverish activity, supported by a vast bureaucracy and military presence. Colonial officials, soldiers, and merchants fanned out across the globe, enforcing British authority and integrating new territories into the imperial system. The empire's economic structure remained rooted in mercantilism, but it evolved to suit new realities. Colonies continued to serve as suppliers of raw materials and as markets for British goods. The profits from trade and resource extraction flowed back to London, fueling further investment in industry, infrastructure, and the Navy. This integration was underpinned by an elaborate network of commercial infrastructure, ports, railways, telegraph lines, and warehouses. The British state kept a close watch over its interests, with a constant stream of reports, statistics, and correspondence flowing between colonial outposts and the imperial capital. For many in Britain, the 19th century was a time of unprecedented confidence and stability. The era came to be known as Pax Britannica, a period of relative peace and order, at least from the perspective of the imperial center, enforced by the omnipresent Royal Navy and the reach of British law. International conflicts did not vanish, but the British were often able to mediate, police, or deter violence through their overwhelming power. The sense of security encouraged further economic growth, cultural exchange, and the spread of British institutions. Yet the expansion of empire was rarely a gentle process. Territorial acquisitions were often accompanied by violence, whether in the form of military conquest, suppression of resistance, or the enforcement of order through force. Disease and famine swept through colonized populations, sometimes as unintended consequences of new economic systems, sometimes as direct results of imperial policies. The imposition of British laws, customs, and cultural norms was a double-edged sword. While it brought new institutions and often a shared language, it also disrupted local traditions and social structures. The legacy of this cultural and legal transplantation is still visible in many former colonies, where English law and language remain influential. The question of slavery stands as one of the starkest reminders of the contradictions at the heart of empire. The British Parliament abolished slavery in its dominions in 1833, a decision often celebrated as a moral achievement. But emancipation was far from immediate or complete. Many formerly enslaved people were forced into unpaid apprenticeships, a system that perpetuated exploitation and denied true freedom for years after the legal abolition. This episode underscores the complexities and compromises that lay beneath the surface of imperial rhetoric. The machinery of empire was vast and intricate. Administrators, soldiers, traders, and missionaries each played their part, supported by an ever-expanding bureaucracy. Official records, naval logs, colonial office files, trade statistics, and government correspondence offer a window into the day-to-day workings of this global enterprise. They reveal a world of constant negotiation and adaptation as British officials struggled to impose order, extract resources, and maintain control over diverse and often restive populations. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the British Empire's rise to dominance is its influence on the modern world. English law, language, and institutions took root across continents, shaping the development of societies from Canada to India, from Australia to Nigeria. The empire's global networks of trade and communication laid the groundwork for today's interconnected world. But this legacy is not unambiguously positive. Alongside economic growth and technological progress came displacement, inequality, and cultural upheaval. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at its zenith, a sprawling, complex, and often contradictory edifice. Its rise had been propelled by the defeat of rivals, the might of the navy, the wealth of commerce, and the transformative power of industry. It had reshaped landscapes and lives on a scale rarely seen before or since. And while its power would later wane, the echoes of its dominance continue to reverberate, for better or worse, in the world we inhabit today. Over the course of the 20th century, the British Empire, the vast, globe-spanning entity that had once seemed invincible, began an unmistakable process of unraveling. This decline was not caused by any single cataclysm, but by a convergence of pressures that steadily weakened the imperial structure and made it increasingly difficult for Britain to sustain its far-flung dominions. The world wars, economic exhaustion, and the rise of independence movements in the colonies all played their part, working together to bring an end to centuries of British global supremacy. The First World War had already exposed the vulnerabilities of Imperial Britain. The conflict demanded enormous human and material resources, straining the country's finances and weakening its ability to project power abroad. Yet it was the Second World War that delivered the most decisive blows. The fall of Singapore in 1942, a defeat that stunned both the British public and military, shattered the long-held myth of British invincibility. For generations, Singapore had been considered an impregnable fortress, a symbol of imperial might in the East. Its loss to Japanese forces sent shockwaves through the colonial world. This was visible proof that the empire could be defeated, that its reach and resources had limits. The devastation of the war extended far beyond military defeat. Britain emerged from the conflict with its economy in tatters, deeply indebted and reliant on American loans to stave off further crisis. Across the empire, the aura of prestige and authority that had once held sway was diminished, replaced by a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. The balance of global power had shifted decisively, with the United States and the Soviet Union now dominating the world stage. In this new reality, it became clear that Britain no longer had the capacity, nor, increasingly, the will to maintain its rule over vast overseas territories. At the same time, a powerful tide of nationalism surged through the colonies. Inspired by ideals of self-determination and galvanized by the sacrifices made during the war, movements for independence gathered momentum from India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. The logic of empire, once accepted as inevitable or even benevolent by some, was now challenged at every turn. For many within the colonies, the promise of freedom and nationhood was no longer a distant dream but an urgent demand. The pace of decolonization accelerated dramatically after 1945. India, often called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, achieved independence in 1947, setting a precedent that reverberated across the imperial world. The process was neither uniform nor always peaceful. Each territory faced its own unique set of pressures and negotiated its own path to sovereignty. In some regions, the end of colonial rule was marked by negotiation and relatively orderly transition. In others, it came through violent struggle and painful partition. The withdrawal from Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East followed in rapid succession, transforming the British Empire from a global hegemon into a new entity, the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states bound together by shared history and, in many cases, language and institutions. For Britain itself, the consequences of decolonization were profound. The loss of overseas markets and resources forced a fundamental reassessment of national interests. The country's global role was diminished, and it faced the daunting task of rebuilding its economy and identity in a changed world. No longer could Britain claim to stand at the heart of a vast imperial system. Instead, it had to navigate a new position as a medium-sized power among many, seeking opportunities in Europe and elsewhere. The economic aftershocks of imperial decline were felt in industries that had once relied on colonial ties, and in the shifting patterns of migration that brought former colonial subjects to Britain's shores, reshaping society in ways that continue to be debated today. Yet the end of empire was not only a story of retreat and loss. The legacies of British rule remain deeply embedded in the political, legal, and cultural systems of many former colonies. The English language, for instance, became a global lingua franca, spoken by millions across continents. Legal systems modeled on English common law persist in countries as diverse as India, Nigeria, and Canada, shaping the administration of justice and the operation of government. Institutions such as parliamentary democracy, the civil service, and the rule of law were adapted, sometimes with substantial modification to local conditions, becoming part of the national fabric in many newly independent states. This legacy, however, is complex and often fraught. The boundaries drawn by colonial administrators, frequently imposed with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or religious realities on the ground, have contributed to persistent tensions and conflicts, particularly in Africa and South Asia. In some cases, these artificial borders forced disparate groups into uneasy coexistence, laying the groundwork for future instability and violence. The legacy of the British Empire's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of colonized peoples has left deep scars, manifested today in economic disparities, social tensions, and ongoing debates about reparations and historical responsibility. Historians and economists continue to debate the mixed effects of colonialism on development. There is evidence to suggest that British rule in some territories brought investments in infrastructure and education, laying foundations for future growth. Railways were built, legal codes standardized, and schools established. Yet these benefits were often unevenly distributed and accompanied by significant harms: the extraction of resources, the disruption of local economies, and the imposition of foreign authority frequently led to declines in living standards for many. The trauma of forced labor, land dispossession, and social engineering reverberates through generations, complicating any simple assessment of the empire's impact. Cultural influence is another enduring aspect of the imperial legacy. British sports cricket, football, and rugby took root in far-flung lands and became sources of national pride in places as distant as India, Australia, and the Caribbean. The spread of the English language facilitated communication and commerce on a global scale, yet it also contributed to the erosion of indigenous languages and traditions. Literary and artistic exchanges flourished, but the global dominance Britain once enjoyed in the arts and industry has waned. Today, while British music, literature, and film maintain a presence on the world stage, they exist alongside a vibrant tapestry of voices and influences from former colonies and beyond. The process of decolonization itself was rarely straightforward. In some territories, the withdrawal of British authority was accompanied by violence, civil war, or partition. The path to independence could be winding and fraught with setbacks shaped by local leadership, international pressures, and the legacies of colonial governance. In other cases, the transition was more peaceful, marked by negotiation and the gradual transfer of power. Each story is distinct, reflecting the diversity of experiences and outcomes that characterize the end of empire. Even as Britain relinquished formal control over its empire, it retained a handful of overseas territories, 14 in total, as of the early 21st century. These remnants of empire, scattered from the South Atlantic to the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, remain subjects of debate regarding their status, governance, and the rights of their inhabitants. Their existence is a reminder that the story of the British Empire is not entirely relegated to the past. Within Britain itself, the legacy of empire continues to shape debates about identity, race, and the nation's place in the world. The arrival of immigrants from former colonies has contributed to the emergence of a multicultural society, prompting both celebration of diversity and controversy over integration, inequality, and historical memory. Public monuments, school curricula, and political discourse reflect ongoing efforts to come to terms with the imperial past, whether through commemoration, critique, or calls for redress. Internationally, the Commonwealth of Nations stands as a testament to the enduring influence of Britain's imperial history. Though a voluntary association, the Commonwealth links former colonies and Britain through shared values and cooperation, facilitating dialogue and exchange. Its existence raises questions about the meaning of post-imperial relationships, the persistence of common institutions, and the tensions between past injustices and present aspirations. The story of the British Empire's decline and legacy is thus one of profound transformation. The forces that brought about the end of Empire War, economic strain, and the rise of nationalist movements were global in scope and impact. The legacies of colonial rule are similarly far-reaching, touching aspects of law, politics, culture, and economics in ways that continue to shape the lives of millions. The boundaries drawn by British administrators, the institutions they established, and the cultural practices they promoted have left marks that are not easily erased. At the same time, the experience of colonization and decolonization has generated new forms of identity, creativity, and resistance. Former colonies have forged their own paths, drawing on and transforming the legacies of empire to build nations that are at once connected to and separate from their colonial past. In Britain, the reckoning with imperial history remains ongoing, challenging the country to confront uncomfortable truths and to envision its future in a world that has moved beyond the certainties of empire. The archives of this period, government records, decolonization documents, and contemporary analyses offer a window onto the complexities and contradictions of imperial decline. They reveal a world in flux, where the certainties of the 19th century gave way to the uncertainties and possibilities of the 20th and beyond. The end of the British Empire was not a single moment but a protracted process shaped by struggle, negotiation, and adaptation on a global scale. In the end, the British Empire's enduring impact lies not only in the material and institutional legacies it left behind, but in the ongoing conversations, sometimes contentious, sometimes hopeful, about what it means to live in a world shaped by the forces of empire and decolonization. The story does not end with the lowering of the Union Jack over distant capitals. It continues in the lives of people, the structures of societies, and the debates that animate both Britain and its former colonies today.